Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm the director of Carnegie Europe, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session today on Three's a Crowd, the EU-Serbia-Russia triangle. The opportunity to organize this discussion is provided by the publication of a paper here at Carnegie Europe by Dimitar Bechev on Hedging Its Bets, Serbia Between Russia and the European Union. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined, obviously, by the author, but also by Sonja Licht and Jelena Džankić. Sonja is the president of the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence, based in Belgrade. And Jelena is professor of global governance at the Robert Schuman Institute at the European University Institute. So I'm very happy that we will have this conversation. But before we get into the details, I just would like to pass the floor to my colleague Tom de Waal, because this paper that Dimitar produced is the second paper of a new initiative that Tom de Waal is leading, and I would just like to share with you a few bullet points on what this initiative is about. It's called Europe. Tom, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Rosa. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Very glad to be with you. I won't take up your time, but just to say, as Rosa mentioned, this is the second paper in a series which will be ongoing this year and indeed next year from Carnegie Europe, entitled Europe's East. It's basically looking at anything which is in the eastern neighborhood of the EU, EU policy towards it. We began with a paper from Stefan Meister, a kind of programmatic paper. Dimitar's is the second paper. I've just commissioned a third paper on the EU and Central Asia. So every 2 months or so, there will be a paper and a discussion, hopefully contributing to this policy debate. We're putting the webpage of Europe's East on the YouTube page if you're watching that, and we very much hope to see you in the future. And with that, back to you, Rosa, and I'll disappear from the screen. And I wish you a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom. And Dimitar, let me pass the floor to you so that you can illustrate some of the findings of your paper. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about Russia's influence in Serbia, but not enough analysis about how actually that influence plays out, both in the country and in the region. And your paper really fills a gap on that. Can you take us through your main points, Dimitar?
Thank you, Rosa. And before I start, let me apologize to all the viewers for being late due to connectivity problems. Well, Serbia has generated headlines of late because of the war in Ukraine, where Serbia has taken a position not very typical of anybody else in Europe, save maybe Turkey, being committed to its membership in the EU on the one hand, but on the other hand, pressing forward with the special relationship it has evolved with Russia. Indeed, Russia has been in the news in Serbia all the time, be it because of what the government is doing on the economic front, be it because of various civil society groups, or shall I say uncivil society, trying to lionize Putin and sound all the talking points that the Kremlin has been generating in the connection of the war. But many external observers have been puzzled. What is Serbia doing in this war and in the response to the war? And the paper really tries two things. First of all, to take stock of Serbia's behavior, because there is more to it than meets the eye. And second of all, to look at the underlying drivers of Serbian policy, and especially Aleksandar Vučić, the president, whose overwhelming presence in national politics and foreign policy making is hard to deny. And finally, maybe say a few words about how we go from here, where the relationship with the EU is moving, with Serbia being in this Janus phase position. So, number one, Serbia, of course, has declined to impose sanctions on the Russians. But at the same time, if you look at their behavior at the United Nations General Assembly, they've been consistent in renouncing the aggression against Ukraine in order to ingratiate themselves to the West, but also because of genuine belief that the territorial order, the sanctity of borders, is something that it's not up for questioning. So this idea that Russia has been using the Kosovo precedent since 2008 really is something that always touched the wrong nerve in Serbia. It's just that until recently, when last month, President Vučić spoke out in 2 interviews against Russia. That was under wraps, pretty much. So this is one point of friction that you observe. Secondly, Russia has been aligned with lots of people on the far right, who you might argue are part and parcel of what Vučić has been doing, in the sense of using nationalism to create legitimacy and giving free rein to his tabloid media, but now has come to haunt him because the genie is out of the bottle, and Russia empowers people to the right of him. Thirdly, on the economic front, Serbia has been one of the countries importing Russian gas and going forward with this energy connection that is, according to the government, essential for the well-being and the welfare of individual citizens. But there is a balancing act there as well, in the sense that longer term, Serbia is looking at diversifying energy supplies, and that will come in the shape of the new interconnector connecting it to Bulgaria and Greece longer term. So this is the hedging game that the title refers to. And the question is, can the EU tilt the balance further to the West, assuming that, if we are realistic, it's hard to foresee a scenario where Serbia extricates itself from the Russian embrace. And I think there is an opening right now, and I'll be curious to listen to the other panelists who, of course, have many years of experience and insight into the same set of issues. And this is to do with the new French-German proposal on Kosovo. And that's my last point, really. Yesterday, we heard Miroslav Lajcak, who is High Representative Borrell's envoy to the region, suggesting that both Serbia, that is Aleksandar Vučić, and the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti, are prepared to attend a summit. And the Kosovars have mellowed their position on the so-called association or community of Serbian municipalities. That's, I think, the subtext there. So there might be a bit more space after the recent months of escalation in Kosovo, more space for compromise. And if the Kosovo issue is removed or somehow diffused to an extent, I think that will open opportunity for Serbia to align itself more closely with the West. But of course, finally, a note of caution that Aleksandar Vučić, I don't think he'll abandon Russia. He'll cut the ties. There'll always be some sort of a balancing act. And the question is how you manage to contain the negative fallout on the region from that, and also to make sure that, if not rhetoric, in substance, Serbia toes the line with the West. And let me stop here with this initial set of remarks.
Thank you very much, Dimitar. I'd like to turn to Sonja, because I mean you live in Belgrade. You have a long history of engaging in Serbian politics. I mean, there are billboards of Putin in the streets of Belgrade, and public opinion polls show consistent preference of Serbs towards their Russian brothers or cousins. How does it look from Serbia? How do you see? How do you find Dimitar's paper and how it looks at the impact of this relationship with Russia on Serbian politics?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this conversation, and I want to thank Dimitar for his paper. I think it is problematizing, as always, very well the situation in our part of the world. Of course, he's close to us in many ways also, and that plays a role. That plays a role in understanding, in fact, the psyche, I would say, of the people in the Western Balkans and in Serbia as well. And if I talk about the psyche, I can't but immediately quote our dear friend Remzi Lani from the Tirana Institute for the Media Institute, who a few years ago, in fact, said and repeated several times since that we are all transitioning from repression to depression. And this is, I would say, very, very true for the Serbia situation at the moment. Depression mixed with confusion and mistrust. Not really too friendly states of mind for a rational debate. And this is what, in fact, I think for people like me is quite worrisome. The lack of rationality, first and foremost, when it comes to the foreign policy issues. Of course, I wouldn't say that Serbia is alone in such a problem, but at the moment, this is very visible. That emotion, and this is visible also in public opinion polls. So this basically is very much the close to majority, if not the majority opinion, that in fact state of mind that in foreign policy emotions are much stronger than rational thinking, and this is where I find the basis for this pro-Russian attitude, this belief that Russia is there to be an eternal friend of Serbia, which, by the way, it wasn't for many, many different times in history. But who remembers 1948 and the clash with Stalin? Who remembers the invasion of 5 occupied countries of Czechoslovakia when Josip Broz Tito, in fact, escaped to Brioni, the far further away and closer to Italy than anything else in former Yugoslavia, because he was more or less convinced that the next is Yugoslavia to be occupied. And there was a huge outroar of anger in our former country when this happened. I remember it very well, but of course, I belong to the dinosaur generation. So the new ones do not know these things and don't really care. In the same time, I want to underline that it was not always so, even in the recent past. I would like to remind you that in 2003, after the Thessaloniki Declaration, where the entire Western Balkan was promised European future, a future in the European Union. So in 2003, only 4 years after the NATO invasion or the NATO attack on then Yugoslavia, in fact, Serbia and Montenegro, including Kosovo, 57% of Serbian citizens believed that their security will be guaranteed if they join the EU. In March 2022, this percentage fell to 13%. By the way, when we talk about security and EU, obviously it is not only about hard security, but security in general. So there is a shift in opinions, in state of mind, but when it comes to very concrete debate about everyday life, the situation is really different. Of course, the most important political debate at the moment is on Kosovo, and it is not to be surprising because, by the way, Miroslav Lajčák just said yesterday that he was 10th time in Pristina since the beginning of the year and 7th time in Belgrade. Clear. And plus, of course, let us not forget the very important role of US in this whole story, including Escobar's, the US envoy, who obviously played a very, very important role to convince, I would say, Prime Minister Kurti and helped him to change his opinion about the dialogue and the paper, the originally French-German paper, which we heard yesterday. And so I think that we are closer to resuming the dialogue than we were in the last 2 or 3 years. We'll see what will be coming out of it. But in the same time, if we talk about rational and emotional, I saw the figures of the public opinion poll done in January this year by a very respected pollster, where in the first 10 answers, spontaneous answers to the question, what are the most important issues for the Serbian citizens, Kosovo is not. So again, we have this I would say, movement between emotional and rational, between the fantasy, which is Russia. Russia is a fantasy in many different ways. Not in everything, of course, because there is their vote in the UN Security Council. There is this gas story, but in the same time, let us not forget that Russia bought the Serbian petrol facilities for a very small amount of money, that they are paying a very low rent for, in fact, pumping out oil from Serbia. And this is not exactly a very friendly approach of a huge country with huge resources, especially to such a small country with small resources as Serbia. So things are more complicated and very much in the field of fantasy when compared to the EU, where every single time then there is a partnership promise from the EU, such as in 2014, the Great Floods, in 2015, the migration and the Balkan route, when Serbia, together with other Western Balkan leaders, was invited at the same table to discuss, etc., etc. We could go on, visa liberalization and so on. When there are real events where the EU's potentials and support is there, you can see that there is a rise in not only support to the EU, but in the belief that we do belong there and that we are going, should go at least in that direction.
Thank you very much, Sonja. I think I liked your quotation of Ramzilani from transition from depression to depression. And I'd like to ask Jelena, turning to you. I mean, I guess that illustrates a little bit also the story of the accession towards the European Union. So, bearing in mind the paper that Dimitar wrote and how Russia gets in the way and the sort of state of accession, given that you've done a lot of work on that, what would be your comments?
Yes, thank you so much, Rosa, for inviting me to speak, and thank you for the lovely introduction and the opportunity to comment on Dimitar's fascinating paper. And I wanted to start by commenting on a sort of a balancing act, which I see happening at two different levels. Which is funny because, Dimitar, you start your analysis by citing poet Brian Mee, saying that you can't sit on two chairs at the same time, especially if they're that far apart. Well, unless you're Chuck Norris or Jean-Claude Van Damme, you can't. But in the case of Serbia, we seem to have both. We seem to have Serbia on the one hand side, which is in a way fence-sitting, as you rightly point out in your paper. And what I was reminded of when reading your analysis was actually there's just like the Serbian coat of arms. One head looking to the east and the other head looking to the west. And if you think about it also historically, I'm not going to go into history, but there have been quite a lot of historical trajectories and historical episodes in which Serbia's head in foreign policy was looking at the east, at the west at the same time. Now, in the current circumstances, What I try to argue is that, on the one hand side, Serbia has to do this, because it has to balance between the historical narratives of closeness to Russia, through culture, through religion, etc., etc. And these things appeal, as we all know, to the population. So in a way, they reinforce the populist rhetoric and feed into these national and nationalist narratives. And at the same time, Serbia has to do it because there's this competing or overlapping, if you wish, narrative of Serbia's Europeanness, which is equally appealing to people who seek, in a way, a better life. And I think if you take a look at the opinion polls in Serbia, you will see this duality as well, as a sort of a cultural closeness to Russia, and then a very practical one in terms of feeling European and wishing to live a European life. And obviously, there's also the question of the assistance and investment that's related to Serbia's EU accession. On the other hand side, Serbia can do this, and it can do this because the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and the Serbian government are well aware of how important Serbia is for regional stability and security. And I'll speak about this later on during this session. Now, on the other hand, we have another balancing act. And in this case, it's the EU, which is making a sort of a trade-off in terms of praising Serbia for its success in the context of EU integration. And we have seen the failure of Serbia to align with the European foreign policy, et cetera, and also other issues that have been mentioned in the report and in the Council conclusions. Now, if you think about it through the same prism, as I've explained for Serbia, the EU has to do it. It has to do it because it has made the security, stability, democracy trade-off initially in the context of the Western Balkans. And it equally can do it because this very security, stability, democracy trade-off that has been made perhaps even 20 years ago has enabled the rise of authoritarian elites who are ready to play this sort of a double game and of flirtation with the East and the West for their own political interest. So I think that for now, I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to follow up in the second round.
Thank you very much, Jelena. So basically, both Serbia is bound to pursue a certain line, and the EU is also, so they're both constrained. And I think that leads me actually to what I'd like to ask all of you. I mean, Dimitar, you have several, in your conclusions, you have several suggestions as to how the EU could handle things differently. You also mentioned in your earlier remarks about the potential opening now in Serbia-Kosovo talks that maybe there might be a breakthrough. And I think, you know, looking at things from Brussels, you just wonder how can you get out of this sort of catch-22 situation where both Serbia and the EU are bound by decisions made time ago. So how can we find, you know, what are potential entry points for change? What could make matters different? Dimitar, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll move on to our other speakers. And I'll ask you just to be a little bit briefer because we will want to open up this conversation to our audience. And let me perhaps take the opportunity to just encourage you to start submitting questions so that we can also involve those who are watching us. Dimitar, please.
Well, I tend to be very skeptical on the capacity of the EU to galvanize democratic change. That's one of the lessons learned, unfortunately, from the past 30 years, and not just in the Western Balkans. That elites in the run-up to accession sort of pay lip service very often, and sometimes they implement reforms. But unless you have ownership, and unless you have pressure from below, democratic consolidation doesn't happen. And Serbia, unfortunately, is not in a very good position. Other countries in the Western Balkans have much more competitive politics, even Montenegro, where Jelena is originally from. You might think, whatever you think about the crisis and the stalemate in Montenegro, but it's much more of a pluralistic environment compared to what Serbia ended up with. So can the EU make a positive difference? Probably it can, but it has to find a way to navigate the second balancing act we discussed between elected governments, because the likes of Vučić, Kurti, and the rest have democratic legitimacy. They win elections. But also empowering civil society, which wants to hold government accountable. And the particular difficulty in Serbia, to my mind, is that civil society, there is a spectrum of actors, some of which are illiberal or even anti-European, although they want accountability as well. But yeah, I mean, the headline is that unless Serbia helps itself, I don't think Borrell or Charles Michel or anybody else will be able to democratize the country.
Dimitar, can I just follow up? Because we didn't talk much about it here, but in your paper, you also talk about the regional repercussions of Russia's relationship with Serbia. And, flipping it the other way around, should the other countries, such as Montenegro, make progress on the accession process in a visible way, would that perhaps have an impact on Serbian politics? I mean, looking at neighbors moving forward on the accession track, could that change politics in Serbia, for instance?
In theory, yes, but the actual record is not very encouraging, right? I don't want to get into the weeds of Montenegrin politics for various reasons, not least because of Jelena being here, but also Sonja watching. But if there is a country performing better, that will set a demonstration effect. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. And what happened with North Macedonia as well is discouraging, because it validates Vučić's narrative. They don't want us. And therefore, we'll do what we want to do, cooperate with the EU, but also diversify options, have the likes of China and Russia involved. And that's the tone in the region these days.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe let me turn back to Jelena, because you mentioned Montenegro. So maybe can you take this cue? And also with the same question, is there anything that could make a difference in your view? And then I'll turn to Sonja.
I think that, there are different issues that we can think about in this context. One is perhaps that for quite some time, there have been some perhaps even unrealistic expectations of the EU and the type of change it can bring about to societies. Mm-hmm. And there I fully agree with Dimitar that essentially there needs to be democratic change bottom up. Now, when it comes to the case of Serbia, I'm not sure, as Dimitar has said, the bar is not that high. So I don't think that there will be a country that will go far enough in the foreseeable future in the region to motivate Serbia to, in a way, go ahead in the process. What I think perhaps might be a game changer is a different approach to the context of stability in the region, because I think that Serbian elites are well aware, and Vučić is well aware of Serbia's importance for regional stability. And this is also the case because Serbia has substantial kin minorities in quite a lot of the region's countries. So I think that if perhaps there is an approach of the EU towards regulating in a way or towards moderating these stability-related issues, there might be a push for Serbia to behave differently in the context of EU accession and to try and rebalance its relationship with Russia as well.
Thank you very much, Jelena. I'd like to turn now to Sonja, and a bit with the same question, perhaps more focused on Serbia. I mean, is there anything, you talked about, political opposition doesn't really exist in Serbia, you talked about civil society. Is there a glimmer of change anywhere in your view? What could bring about change from within the country?
Well, as you just mentioned, unfortunately, the political opposition is very fragmented. And in fact, those who could bring some different political attitudes and those who are more inclined to democratic reform are in fact losing these days to the nationalists because they are again fragmented and their voice is not strong enough. Now, how to make their voice stronger enough? I think it is extremely important at the moment to remember the 90s, to remember that we had a situation which looked like as desperate or even more desperate, I mean, internally, as far as democratic reforms are concerned than now. And yet, the independent media, civil society managed to build a quite strong force in order to really bring a change. Of course, the situation is different. We shouldn't forget the depopulation problem, that many potential agents of change are leaving the country and being sucked in by Germany and Switzerland and then Austria and so on. That's one thing. But the other thing which I would like to underline is that there is, it seems, more real lack from our Western friends in understanding the power of the soft power potential contrary to Russia. So, in fact, I think the glimpse of hope really comes from the genuine civil society that still exists in Serbia, not only in Belgrade, but also there is a growing energy locally. Citizens are unhappy for various reasons, and they are getting also self-organized. It's true, it's especially on environmental issues, but not only. So I think this is a moment when it has to be understood that even the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue must trickle down to the society. In order to do that, there is a need for both political but also other forms of support that are more and more lacking. And this is difficult to understand. This is why I'm returning to our experiences from the 90s. Mm-hmm. I believe that this bottom-up approach is in fact the potential to make the political forces move, especially those who are based on liberal values, move more strong and more determined with an alternative view, not only on politics, but also on institutions and on all the other important aspects of democratic.
Thank you. So I have a comment from Robert Cooper, which I'm going to read out. The dilemma for the EU is that, on the one hand, Serbia is essential for stability in the Balkans. On the other hand, one Orban in the EU is already too many. And of course, Orban is probably the closest friend and ally of Vučić, and I think they have an idea of what the EU should look like. And it's an EU of many states, a bit like Hungary under Orban, rather than the democratic countries further north and west. Let me have a few questions. So what I'm going to do is answer them a little bit. So I'm going to there's a couple of questions which are more about Russia. So can you comment on Russia's support and maybe even sponsorship of the Open Balkan Initiative? And then a question by someone who's puzzled by Dimitar Vučić not supporting Russia because of the Kosovo precedent. Surely Putin's line that Ukraine cannot exist as a state is the same as Vučić on Kosovo. So if I could leave it more about Russia's influence and ideological affinity. And Dimitar, I'd like to start with you also. I mean, one of the questions is actually seeking clarification for something you said. And then I'll move on to the other questions which have been arriving. Okay,
the one government that was supportive was actually the United States. But now that the EU has gotten its act together and it's pushing for the regional common market, I think open Balkans can be relegated, at least for the time being. So all the conspiracy theories about what Vučić was up to with Rama and the rest can be laid to rest. On Ukraine and Kosovo, I think this is the wrong parallel for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, Ukraine is a recognized state. It's a member of the United Nations. So Russia doesn't dispute its right to existence in a Jesuit way. I mean, it wants to annex part of it, and the rhetoric is genocidal. But I don't think anybody in Russia has gone as far as to say that the sovereignty of Ukraine in some sort of a truncated way as a vassal state should be abolished. The game is different. Secondly, I mean, Serbia and Kosovo find themselves in a very different position than Ukraine and Russia. In Kosovo, let me remind everyone, you have a NATO mission. So, and for all intents and purposes, Kosovo is part of NATO. Indeed, if there's a normalization agreement, it's not a wild jump of imagination, one leap of faith to see Kosovo moving forward as Montenegro or North Macedonia into Kosovo, into membership. And that's a real constraint if Vučić is an annexationist, which is a big if. If he wants to gobble Kosovo, I mean, he has to fight the West. And does Serbia want that? I don't think it does. And Russia has given up on the West, and Serbia hasn't as well. It's dependent on trade, and it's a different kettle of fish. So this idea that Serbia is in the same line of business as Russia has some support at the rhetorical level, but in substance, I don't see the parallel, frankly. And I don't think that the same logic applies. If anything, the Russian failure to swallow Ukraine is a warning sign to anybody in the Balkan who is into the business of revisionism. I mean, look at Dodik in Bosnia as well, by the way.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Jelena and Sonja, but I also have another question which I'd like to throw in there for you, especially for Jelena, because it's right up your street. What is your take on the reasons for the uneven and slow progress in adjusting to the EU acquis with respect to the judiciary, rule of law, justice, and anti-corruption? So, Jelena, I think we'll start from you and then move on to Sonja. And feel free also to comment on the questions on Russia in the region.
Thank you so much, Rosa. If it goes too long, please feel free to interrupt me. I'll try and be as brief as possible. I think we can think about the uneven and slow progress in the context of the reform of judiciary and rule of law. If we think about the context of state capture in Serbia, but also in quite a lot of the countries in the region, where political elites, along with their, extension on economic actors, have captured most of the A, institutional, and B, economic setup in these countries. Now, having rule of law and accountability in such context means an absolute loss for those who are in power. So they would either need to create some scapegoats, as have been cases before, or harm themselves, which at this point, very few or no political leaders in the region would be willing to do. And on the other hand side, and I go back to what Dimitar has said before. There is a very low level of societal awareness of the political processes, meaning that on the one hand side, we have the institutional state capture, but we also have captured societies in a way, because people are constantly fed these narratives that distract them from real problems and that do not explain to them the political processes and their roles in them. So in contexts such as this one, where politicians have so much power, and people are unaware of their power in society, if you wish, it's very difficult to move on and introduce reforms that are related to the rule of law and that would be harmful to domestic politicians. And I briefly just wanted to comment on Robert Cooper's mention that the dilemma for the EU is that on the one hand side, Serbia is essential for regional stability, and on the other hand side, one Orban in the EU, well, perhaps several Orbans in the EU are a little bit too many. And I would absolutely agree with this. And this is in a way central to this nexus or this trade-off between security, stability, and democracy that the EU has made and has made quite a lot of time ago. On the other hand side, I think that we can think about this in different ways. We can think about this stability, security, democracy trade-off through the eyes of different institutions within the EU, because I think that would help us to understand the ways in which the EU approaches the region a bit more comprehensively. I'll leave it at this and happy to follow up.
Can I have 2 fingers on Orban, Rosa?
Yeah, sure.
Just to play the devil's advocate, and I'm curious to see what Sonja thinks about it as well. I think Orban is the real problem because he's the model for Serbia. Yes. All things being equal, Serbia is moving in that direction. There won't be a Putin scenario in Serbia. Yeah. And it's even worse, though, because Urbanization might be the best case for Serbia moving forward. Because if you think about Hungary, it has a grudge against neighbors, irredentism, but it has recognized all the neighbors. So Trianon is everywhere, the pre-Trianon borders of Hungary, Greater Hungary. But it's not that Hungary has questioned the sovereignty of any of its neighbors, including Ukraine, by the way. Also, Hungary is talking the talk on being pro-Russian, but when the chips are down in Brussels, it hasn't blocked most of the sanctions. I mean, there are some exceptions, but it hasn't played hardball, which is not a given for Serbia. If Serbia becomes a member state, it might actually go further than Orban. So a country, Orban-like scenario in Serbia will be bad for citizens because it means perpetuation of the captured states. But realistically, it might be what we're looking at longer term, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you, Dimitar. Sonja, would you like to pick up on these? Make it brief because there are more questions coming through, so I'd like to have another round.
Well, I think the danger of urbanization is there, but I also would like to remind you that there was not one single political force in Serbia until now, and I don't think there will be one who will manage to have two-thirds of the parliament. And so there is a major difference, I would say. The difference is that, in fact, Hungary, I happen to know it quite well, Hungary is much more a rural society than Serbia. In fact, Serbia is changing from a rural society in a dramatic way, since only in the larger towns or cities, you have a growth of population. The rest is, in fact, going the other way. And I think that this urbanization combined with, as I already mentioned, the bottom-up initiatives in very different places, in very different fields, in fact, is opening, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I do see that there is a potential for opening a different path. Of course, it will also depend very much on how the major actual issues will be resolved. And I think here, first and foremost, whether we will really be able to enter a path of normalization with Kosovo.
Thank you, Sonja. So it's good always to have the silver lining and the glimmer of hope. Thank you for that. And Balkan politics doesn't lend itself to much optimism, let's be honest. I have two questions, and I'm going to put them together. So pick and choose whether you respond to both or which ones you respond to. So I have a comment. I'm going to go to Dimitar again first, because this comment is right up his street this time. Athens and Skopje were very brave. It's from Dennis McShane. Thank you, Dennis. Athens and Skopje were very brave in dropping in mutual recognition and reaching a deal on the name issue. But now Sofia is doing all it can to sabotage this breakthrough. Is this a possible precedent for Serbia and Kosovo, and the fact that the EU is weak on Bulgaria? Dimitar, that's your country of origin. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, the EU is Bulgaria as well. Bulgaria is a stakeholder. It's not an external party, and that's part of the problem. But also the type of issues between Greece and North Macedonia, but also between Kosovo and Serbia are different. And the stakes in those Macedonian disputes are symbolic, which means that the disputes are low-key. Nobody will be shooting. Nobody will be fighting on this one. But they've been around since the 1960s, and I don't think they'll evaporate. The best thing we can hope is to agree to disagree and move forward. But I'm afraid this one will come back with vengeance. And of course, you're right, that opens a huge question mark for Kosovo. And it's not even Bulgaria, it was the Cyprus hijacking the Turkey accession. After that, it's clear that you cannot leave those territorial disputes unsolved before membership. And down the road, it will be a big dilemma or question mark for EU policymakers in the future. Because if Serbia is to join, even having recognized Kosovo, there will be the temptation to use veto power. Say there is a Serbian municipality association, but for some reason Pristina doesn't respect its rights. That will be an ultimate trigger for Belgrade to apply its veto powers. So I'm afraid the best we can hope for is to have those two together, which might not be good for Serbia because it's much more advanced in the sort of the boring part of integration. But right now, it's politics. You don't have to worry something that is coming in 15 years or 20 years.
Thanks, Dimitar. I'm going to read the two last questions and then ask you each to comment. So one is a question on the war in Ukraine. Is there a perception that friendship with Russia is stopping Serbia from entering the EU? How true is this? Is Russian soft power able to stop EU integration of Serbia? That's the first question. And then we have another question from Zuzana Seleni. I wonder if Vučić is also a model for Orban, managing Serbia's economy out of the EU with Russian and Chinese foreign direct investments. Is this correct? So shall we go in reverse order now? And I'll ask maybe Sonja to start, and then Jelena, and then Dimitar. Pick and choose the questions, or if you have any additional thoughts. Now is your last chance, I think, unless some other question comes through at the last. Oh, yes, there's another question. Sonja, this is for you. So I'm going to add this in. What is the rational choice? As Jelena says, balancing relations seems to be the option without credible membership prospects, unresolved Kosovo question, energy dependence. Okay, so if we can address these last three questions in the remaining 9 minutes, that would be great. Sonja, you're muted. No, it's not.
Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, I think that definitely the rational choice is European integration, regardless of when the membership is going to happen. I fully agree with Dimi. By the way, I don't think that the membership of any of these countries really is realistic without a change in EU itself, especially regarding the voting system, because that is something that won't be allowed to make these veto games around, no doubt. So, but I do believe that there is also a chance for a larger EU political, in the first place, involvement, but also financial, on the path toward membership. For example, on energy issues, very important. There is a lot of potential and there are plans on the table. I know there are also debates. The Norwegians are very interested in investing in energy infrastructure in the Western Balkans. I do believe that this is one way to go also for the EU, not only as Serbia-wise, but broader. As far as Serbia is concerned, Đerdap 3, the hydroelectric power plant, that is also very important for the future of energy supply to Europe, together with Ukraine, because these are the two countries with real hydroelectric power potential in the vicinity, are something that we should think about if we think long term. I think short term, it has to be a support for every single actor that is democratic potential for Serbia. Longer term, energy investment in energy infrastructure, and definitely help as much as possible that the Kosovo-Serbia relations be normalized.
Thank you, Sonja. Jelena.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosa. I think Dimitar has already addressed the Kosovo-Serbia issue, and I'll focus on whether Russian soft power is able to stop the EU integration on Serbia, and just say two things briefly. First thing, we have to be realistic about what the process of EU integration entails. Sonja has already mentioned some things in her last comment, and also the timelines, because it is not going to happen today, it is not going to happen tomorrow, it may not ever happen if certain things develop in certain ways. Now, if we think about the Russian soft power and what it can do in the context of EU integration, it depends again on where things end up being. And for instance, there is a discussion in Serbia at the moment, and Sonja, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, on whether to facilitate citizenship acquisition for Russians who have come to Belgrade over the last year. And there are significant numbers of them in Belgrade especially, and in Novi Sad. It also will depend on, for instance, the level of foreign direct investment in Serbia of Russian companies, trade relations, but not only the fact of those relations, but also the political negotiations and deals that they entail, because these will have to be contextualized in the whole debate on the rule of law. And finally, the effect of cultural influences of Russia on the society of Serbia. So I think that we have to take into account the whole picture of Russia's perhaps soft power. Now, the actual question that I think will be more important than is Russia's soft power able to stop Serbia's EU integration is how will Russia's soft power affect the democratic institutions and democratic society in Serbia. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitar. The floor is yours.
Well, not much to add. It's been a very rich discussion, but I hope that we managed to expose the complexities. I mean, Serbia, of course, will create a lot of interest down the line. But I hope to end on a positive note and think that there is some positive force. And so I was happy to hear what Sonja had to say, that there is silver lining in the country. Just to say that we might be looking at another election later this year, if you believe the speculations in Belgrade yesterday. So there is a chance that we have another session with Carnegie Europe in a few months' time.
Thank you very much, Dimitar. Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Jelena. Indeed, I hope that we will be following the Balkans a little bit more closely. Dimitar has already been publishing quite a few articles with us. So I'd like to thank you all for joining in this conversation. I have to say, excellent timekeeping. I'm not used to it. We're actually a couple of minutes early, but thank you very much. And stay tuned for our events and for our publications. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.